The giant was bleeding to death in William Turner's cornfield, and the farmer had never seen anything like him. Standing nearly 7 feet tall even while collapsed, with massive shoulders and arms like tree trunks, the Apache young man looked more like a creature from legend than a human being. But as William knelt beside the wounded giant, he saw something in those dark eyes that made him forget about size and appearance. This was a person in pain, alone and afraid, abandoned by his own people because nature had made him different. What William Turner didn't know, as he dragged the unconscious Apache to his farmhouse on that hot August morning in 1878, was that he was about to become the protector of the one person who could save Cedar Falls from the greatest threat it had ever faced. Because sometimes the most unlikely guardian angels come in the most unexpected packages, and sometimes the people society fears most are the ones society needs most. To understand how William Turner, a simple wheat farmer from Kansas, became the sanctuary for an Apache outcast named Broken Sky, you need to know about the prejudice that had shaped both their lives and the courage that would transform an entire community's understanding of what it means to be different. It was July 15, 1878, when William first settled his family on 160 acres of prairie land outside Cedar Falls, Kansas. At 34, William was a quiet man who had spent most of his adult life working other people's farms, saving every penny to buy land of his own. His wife Martha was a school teacher from Ohio, and their 8-year-old daughter Lucy was the light of both their lives. Cedar Falls was a typical frontier town of about 300 people, built around the railroad depot that connected the wheat farms of central Kansas to the grain markets of Chicago and St. Louis. The town prided itself on being civilized and respectable, with a proper church, a school, and strict social standards that emphasized conformity and conventional behavior. The Turner farm sat 2 miles east of town, far enough away to provide privacy but close enough for Lucy to attend school, and Martha to occasionally substitute teach when the regular teacher was ill. William preferred the isolation. He had always been more comfortable with crops and livestock than with the social complexities of town life. The Apache presence in Kansas was minimal by 1878, with most tribes having been relocated to reservations in Oklahoma Territory. Occasionally, small bands would pass through the area during hunting seasons, but they generally avoided contact with white settlements and caused no trouble for local farmers. That's why William was so surprised to find the giant Apache warrior unconscious in his cornfield on the morning of August 3rd. The young man had clearly been traveling alone, and his injuries suggested he had been in some kind of fight or accident. More puzzling was the fact that he was obviously Apache, but he was far from any known tribal territories. William's first instinct was to ride to town and report the incident to Sheriff Morrison, but something stopped him. The Apache looked very young, maybe 18 or 19, and despite his enormous size, there was something vulnerable about him lying unconscious in the corn rows. William found himself thinking about what Martha always told her students about helping people in need, regardless of who they were or where they came from. So instead of riding to town, William loaded the unconscious Apache into his wagon and took him to the farmhouse, where Martha helped tend to his wounds while Lucy watched with wide-eyed curiosity from the doorway. The Apache's injuries were serious but not life-threatening: a deep gash on his forehead, several broken ribs, and extensive bruising that suggested he had fallen from a great height. As Martha cleaned and bandaged his wounds, she and William speculated about what might have happened to him. "He's so young," Martha observed, "and look at the size of him. I've never seen anyone so tall and strong. Makes you wonder how he got hurt so bad," William replied. Someone his size would be hard to injure accidentally. What they didn't know was that Broken Sky had been cast out by his own Apache band 3 days earlier, not for any crime or betrayal, but simply because his extraordinary size made the other tribal members uncomfortable. At nearly 7 feet tall and weighing close to 300 pounds, Broken Sky had been different from birth, and that difference had made him an outcast even among his own people. When Broken Sky finally regained consciousness 2 days later, his reaction surprised the Turner family. Instead of the anger or suspicion they expected, the giant Apache showed only gratitude and gentle curiosity about the people who had helped him. "Why you help me?" Broken Sky asked in halting English, his voice surprisingly soft for someone so large. "I am stranger. I am Apache." "Because you needed help," Martha replied simply, "and because helping people is what decent folks do." Broken Sky studied Martha's face as if trying to understand a concept that was foreign to him. "My people, they send me away. They say I bring bad medicine. Too big, too different." William felt a pang of sympathy for the young Apache. He understood what it felt like to be different, to not quite fit in with the people around you. "Well, you're welcome to stay here until you're healed up," William said. "After that you can decide what you want to do." What William intended as a few days of recovery became weeks as Broken Sky's injuries healed slowly and his presence on the Turner farm began to create complications that none of them had anticipated. The first problem arose when Lucy accidentally mentioned the big Apache man to her school friends, and word quickly spread through Cedar Falls that the Turner farm was harboring a giant Indian. The reaction from the townspeople was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. Sheriff Morrison was the first official to visit the Turner farm, accompanied by Mayor Henderson and 3 other town council members. Their message was clear: the Apache had to go immediately. "William, I understand you're trying to be Christian about this," Sheriff Morrison said, "but you're putting the whole community at risk. We don't know anything about this Indian, where he came from, or why he's here. For all we know, he could be scouting for a war party." "He's a young man who was injured and needed help," William replied. "He's been nothing but polite and grateful since he's been here." "That doesn't matter," Mayor Henderson interjected. "The people of Cedar Falls won't stand for having a wild Indian living 2 miles from their homes and families. You need to send him away, or we'll have to take action ourselves." The threat was unmistakable, but William found himself unwilling to abandon Broken Sky. Over the past 2 weeks, the Apache had proven himself to be gentle, intelligent, and surprisingly helpful around the farm. Despite his intimidating size, he was careful and considerate, especially around Lucy, whom he seemed to regard with protective affection. More importantly, William had begun to understand the depth of Broken Sky's isolation and pain. The Apache had been rejected by his own people for being different, and William couldn't bring himself to repeat that rejection just because other people were afraid of him. "He stays until he's fully healed," William told the delegation. "After that, it's his choice where he goes." The confrontation with town officials was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, the Turner family found themselves increasingly isolated from the Cedar Falls community. Merchants became reluctant to sell them supplies, other farmers stopped visiting, and Lucy began to face harassment at school from children whose parents had taught them to fear and hate the savage living at the Turner farm. The situation escalated when a group of men from town, led by rancher Stuart Clark, appeared at the Turner farm one evening with rifles and demands that William turn over the Apache immediately. "We're not going to wait any longer, Turner," Clark announced. "That Indian goes tonight, or we'll remove him ourselves." William stood on his front porch, acutely aware that he was outnumbered and outgunned, but refusing to back down. "He's done nothing wrong. He's been helping with the farm work and has never caused any trouble." "He doesn't belong here," another man shouted. "And neither do you, if you're going to side with savages over your own people." The confrontation might have turned violent if Broken Sky hadn't appeared around the corner of the house, his massive frame silhouetted against the evening sky. The sight of the 7-foot Apache caused several of the armed men to step back instinctively, their weapons suddenly seeming inadequate against such an imposing figure. But instead of threatening the townspeople, Broken Sky did something that surprised everyone. He sat down on the ground, making himself appear smaller and less threatening. "I do not want trouble for good family," Broken Sky said, his voice calm and clear. "If my presence brings danger to those who showed me kindness, I will go." William was struck by the dignity and self-sacrifice in Broken Sky's words. Here was a young man who had been rejected by his own people, who had found acceptance and kindness with the Turner family, and who was now willing to leave that sanctuary rather than cause problems for the people who had helped him. "You're not going anywhere," William said firmly. "This is my land, and you're welcome here as long as you want to stay." Stuart Clark and his men left that night without violence, but they made it clear that the issue wasn't resolved. William knew that protecting Broken Sky would continue to cost his family their place in the community, but he also knew that sending the Apache away would cost him something even more valuable: his self-respect. The crisis that would test everyone's courage and reveal the true character of both Broken Sky and the Cedar Falls community came in early September, when a massive prairie fire swept toward the town from the west, driven by high winds and fueled by months of drought. Prairie fires were among the greatest fears of frontier communities, capable of destroying entire towns and killing anyone caught in their path. The fire approaching Cedar Falls was particularly dangerous because it was moving faster than anyone could outrun and seemed too large to be stopped by conventional firefighting methods. As the wall of flames approached the town, panic set in among the residents. Families loaded wagons with their most precious possessions and prepared to evacuate, while the men of the town tried desperately to create firebreaks that might save their homes and businesses. But their efforts were clearly inadequate. The fire was too big, moving too fast, and being driven by winds that scattered sparks for miles ahead of the main blaze. Cedar Falls appeared to be doomed, and its 300 residents faced the choice of fleeing immediately or staying to fight a fire they couldn't possibly defeat. That's when William Turner arrived in town with Broken Sky, offering a solution that no one else had thought of. "There's an old buffalo wallow about a mile northwest of town," William announced to the assembled townspeople. "It's been dry for years, but there's still a depression in the ground surrounded by rocky soil that won't burn easily. If we can dig it out and channel water from Miller's Creek, we can create a fire break big enough to protect the whole town." "That would take days of work," Mayor Henderson protested. "We don't have that kind of time." "We do if we have the right help," William replied, gesturing toward Broken Sky. "He can do the work of 6 men, and he knows how to dig channels and move earth. Give him 20 men and the right tools, and he can create that fire break in 6 hours." The townspeople looked at Broken Sky with a mixture of desperation and skepticism. The same Apache they had been demanding be sent away was now being presented as their salvation. "You trust him to save the town?" Sheriff Morrison asked. "I trust him more than I trust most white men," William replied. "He's got more strength, more courage, and more heart than anyone I've ever known." The debate that followed was brief, not because the townspeople had suddenly overcome their prejudice, but because they had no other options. The fire was going to reach Cedar Falls whether they trusted Broken Sky or not, and his plan was the only one that offered any hope of saving their homes and lives. What followed was 6 hours of the most intense physical labor anyone in Cedar Falls had ever witnessed. Broken Sky worked with superhuman energy and skill, digging channels, moving boulders, and directing the efforts of 20 men who struggled to keep up with his pace. But more impressive than his physical strength was his leadership and knowledge. Broken Sky understood fire behavior, water flow, and soil composition in ways that none of the townspeople had expected. He positioned fire breaks not just where they seemed logical, but where they would be most effective based on wind patterns and terrain features that only someone with extensive wilderness experience would recognize. As the fire approached the town, the makeshift fire break held. The flames were channeled around Cedar Falls, sparing the buildings and allowing the residents to save their community. When the danger had passed and the fire had burned itself out against the rocky ground beyond the town, it was clear that Broken Sky's work had saved hundreds of lives and prevented the complete destruction of the community. The aftermath of the fire brought a transformation in how the people of Cedar Falls viewed their Apache rescuer. Men who had threatened him with rifles now sought him out to thank him personally. Women who had crossed the street to avoid him now brought food and gifts to the Turner farm. Children who had been taught to fear him now listened with fascination to his stories about life on the prairie. But perhaps the most significant change was in how Broken Sky viewed himself. For the first time in his life, his differences, his size, his strength, his unusual knowledge, had been seen as gifts rather than curses. Instead of being rejected for being different, he had been valued precisely because he was different. The integration of Broken Sky into the Cedar Falls community didn't happen overnight, but it was sincere and lasting. The town council formally appointed him as the community's fire prevention specialist, recognizing his expertise in managing the environmental challenges that threatened frontier settlements. Broken Sky used his position to teach the townspeople about reading weather patterns, identifying fire risks, and preparing defensive measures that could protect their homes and businesses. His knowledge proved invaluable not just for fire prevention, but for farming, hunting, and dozens of other aspects of frontier life. More importantly, Broken Sky's acceptance by the Cedar Falls community created a model for how other communities could integrate outsiders and benefit from diversity rather than fearing it. His example influenced how the town dealt with other immigrants, refugees, and anyone else who seemed different from the majority population. William Turner found that his decision to protect Broken Sky had cost him nothing and gained him everything. His family's standing in the community was stronger than ever. Martha's teaching career flourished as she became known for her commitment to helping all students regardless of their backgrounds, and Lucy grew up with a broader understanding of human diversity and the importance of judging people by their character rather than their appearance. Broken Sky lived the rest of his life in Cedar Falls, eventually marrying a widow from town and raising children who inherited both his physical strength and his gentle nature. He became one of the most respected citizens of the community, serving on the town council and helping to mediate disputes between different groups of settlers. When Broken Sky died in 1923 at the age of 64, his funeral was attended by hundreds of people from across Kansas who had heard about the Apache giant who had saved a town and changed how an entire region thought about acceptance and inclusion. The eulogy was delivered by Lucy Turner Morrison, who had grown up under Broken Sky's protective watch and who had become one of Kansas's most effective advocates for civil rights and social justice. Her words captured the essence of what Broken Sky had meant to Cedar Falls and to everyone who had known him. Broken Sky taught us that the people we fear are often the people we most need, Lucy said. He showed us that strength comes not from size or power, but from the willingness to use whatever gifts we have to help others. And he proved that the greatest sanctuary we can offer anyone is not a place, but acceptance, the simple recognition that every person has value, regardless of how different they might seem. Today, the Cedar Falls Community Center houses a museum dedicated to Broken Sky's life and legacy, including exhibits about the Great Fire of 1878 and the firefighting techniques he developed to protect frontier communities. The museum's central display is a replica of the firebreak system that saved the town, along with tools and diagrams that show how Broken Sky's innovations influenced fire prevention throughout the Great Plains. But the museum's most popular exhibit is a collection of letters from children and adults who visited Cedar Falls over the years and learned about the Apache giant who had taught an entire community that differences should be celebrated rather than feared. These letters, written over more than a century, show how Broken Sky's example continued to inspire people long after his death. The story of the Outcast's sanctuary reminds us that the people society rejects often possess exactly the qualities society needs most. Broken Sky's size and strength, which had made him an outcast among his own people, proved to be precisely what Cedar Falls needed to survive its greatest crisis. More importantly, his story shows us that sanctuary is not just about providing shelter to those who need it. It's about creating communities where everyone can contribute their unique gifts without fear of rejection or persecution. William Turner's decision to protect one Apache outcast didn't just save Broken Sky's life, it saved an entire town and created a model for how communities can thrive through inclusion rather than exclusion. In an era when fear of differences continues to divide communities and nations, the example of Broken Sky and Cedar Falls offers hope that understanding and acceptance can triumph over prejudice and fear. Sometimes the greatest threats to our communities come not from those we perceive as different, but from our own unwillingness to recognize the strength that diversity can bring. Broken Sky's legacy reminds us that every person we exclude from our communities takes with them gifts that we might desperately need, and that every person we welcome brings possibilities that we might never have imagined. The Outcast's sanctuary became the community's salvation, proving that the courage to accept others as they are can transform not just individual lives but entire societies. The influence of Broken Sky's story extended far beyond Cedar Falls, inspiring similar acts of acceptance and inclusion throughout the frontier territories. News of the Apache giant who had saved a Kansas town spread through newspapers and word of mouth, reaching communities across the West and challenging long-held assumptions about tribal peoples and cultural differences. Dr. Samuel Richardson, an anthropologist from Harvard University, traveled to Cedar Falls in 1885 to study what he termed the integration phenomenon. His research documented how Broken Sky's acceptance had transformed not just individual attitudes but the entire social and economic structure of the community. What occurred in Cedar Falls represents a fundamental shift in how frontier communities can approach cultural diversity, Dr. Richardson wrote in his 1887 report. Rather than viewing differences as threats to be eliminated, the townspeople learned to see them as resources to be valued. This transformation created a more resilient, more prosperous, and more harmonious community than any homogeneous settlement in the region. Dr. Richardson's research revealed that Cedar Falls had become measurably more successful than neighboring towns in almost every category. The community had lower crime rates, higher agricultural yields, more successful businesses, and greater population growth than comparable settlements that had maintained exclusionary policies toward Native Americans and other outsiders. The economic benefits of inclusion became particularly evident during the drought of 1886, when Broken Sky's knowledge of water conservation and drought-resistant farming techniques helped Cedar Falls maintain agricultural productivity while surrounding communities suffered crop failures. His methods, adapted from traditional Apache agricultural practices, proved far superior to conventional European farming techniques for the challenging conditions of the Great Plains. The success of these techniques led to their adoption by farmers throughout Kansas and neighboring states. Agricultural colleges began studying Broken Sky's methods and incorporating them into their curricula, creating the first formal academic recognition of indigenous agricultural knowledge in American higher education. But perhaps more significantly, Broken Sky's influence extended to the social and political development of Cedar Falls. His presence on the town council introduced perspectives and problem-solving approaches that had never been considered by the all-white leadership that had previously governed the community. When conflicts arose between different groups of settlers, German immigrants, Irish railroad workers, Mexican farm laborers, Broken Sky's mediation skills proved invaluable. His own experience as an outcast had given him deep insight into the psychology of exclusion and acceptance, allowing him to help bridge cultural divides that had seemed insurmountable. The most challenging test of Broken Sky's mediation abilities came in 1889, when a group of Chinese immigrants arrived in Cedar Falls seeking work on the expanding railroad system. The same townspeople who had learned to accept the Apache giant found themselves struggling with new fears and prejudices directed toward the Asian newcomers. Initial reactions to the Chinese workers were hostile. Many residents feared that the immigrants would take jobs from white workers, bring diseases, or threaten the Christian character of the community. There were calls for the town council to pass ordinances prohibiting Chinese settlement, similar to laws that had been enacted in California and other western states. Broken Sky's response to this crisis drew on everything he had learned about prejudice, fear, and the possibility of transformation. Working with William Turner and other community leaders who had supported his own integration, he organized a series of community meetings designed to address fears through direct contact rather than legislation through avoidance. The meetings began with Broken Sky sharing his own story of rejection and acceptance, helping the townspeople remember how their attitudes toward him had changed as they got to know him personally. He then facilitated conversations between longtime residents and the Chinese immigrants, creating opportunities for mutual understanding that gradually broke down the barriers of fear and suspicion. The process wasn't easy or quick. Some residents remained opposed to Chinese settlement, and there were several incidents of harassment and discrimination. But Broken Sky's patient work, combined with the practical benefits that the Chinese workers brought to local construction and agricultural projects, gradually shifted community attitudes toward acceptance and inclusion. Within 2 years, Cedar Falls had developed a reputation as one of the most welcoming communities in Kansas for immigrants and outsiders. This reputation attracted talented and hard-working people from around the world, creating a diverse population that contributed to the town's continued growth and prosperity. The Cedar Falls model became a subject of study for government officials, social reformers, and community leaders throughout the United States. Delegations visited the town to observe how different cultural groups lived and worked together successfully, taking lessons back to their own communities. One of the most influential visitors was Frances Willard, president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and a prominent social reformer. Her 1891 visit to Cedar Falls resulted in a widely read article titled "The Apache's Gift: Lessons in Community Building from the Kansas Prairie." "What I witnessed in Cedar Falls challenges every assumption I held about the incompatibility of different races and cultures," Willard wrote. "Here is proof that diversity strengthens rather than weakens communities, but only when that diversity is approached with courage, compassion, and commitment to justice." Willard's article was reprinted in newspapers and magazines across the country, helping to spread awareness of the Cedar Falls experiment and inspiring similar efforts in other communities. Her endorsement was particularly influential because it came from a respected Christian leader, helping to counter religious arguments that had often been used to justify exclusion and discrimination. The success of the Cedar Falls integration model also influenced federal policy toward Native Americans and other minority groups. Government officials who had previously supported policies of forced assimilation or removal began to consider alternatives that preserved cultural diversity while promoting peaceful coexistence. Broken Sky himself became an unofficial ambassador for these new approaches, traveling to Washington, D.C. several times during the 1890s to consult with Bureau of Indian Affairs officials about reservation policies and tribal-white relations. His insights, grounded in personal experience with both rejection and acceptance, helped shape policies that were more respectful of tribal sovereignty and cultural autonomy. The most significant policy change influenced by Broken Sky's work was the development of the Cedar Falls Protocol, a set of guidelines for government interactions with tribal communities that emphasized consultation, cultural sensitivity, and mutual benefit rather than domination and forced assimilation. The protocol was implemented on reservations throughout the Western Territories, leading to measurable improvements in tribal government relations and reductions in conflict between Native American communities and white settlers. While it didn't eliminate all problems or injustices, it represented a significant step toward more respectful and effective approaches to cultural diversity. Broken Sky's influence extended beyond policy to education and social reform. The integration successes in Cedar Falls inspired the establishment of integrated schools in other frontier communities, challenging the segregation policies that had been standard in most areas of the country. Martha Turner, who had continued her teaching career throughout Broken Sky's residency in Cedar Falls, became a pioneering advocate for multicultural education. Her teaching methods, which incorporated knowledge and perspectives from different cultural traditions, proved so effective that they were adopted by schools throughout Kansas and neighboring states. The Turner Method, as it became known, emphasized the value of learning from diversity rather than simply tolerating it. Students in Turner Method schools consistently outperformed their peers in traditional schools, demonstrating the academic benefits of inclusive educational approaches. By the time of his death in 1923, Broken Sky had lived to see the transformation of Cedar Falls from a small insular frontier town into a thriving, diverse city of more than 5,000 people. The community that had once feared his presence had become a model for the entire nation of how different peoples could live and work together successfully. His funeral was attended by people from dozens of different cultural backgrounds. Apache and Cherokee tribal leaders, Chinese merchants, German farmers, Irish railroad workers, Mexican craftsmen and many others who had found acceptance and opportunity in the community he had helped create. The eulogy delivered by Lucy Turner Morrison captured the essence of what Broken Sky had accomplished during his 45 years in Cedar Falls. Broken Sky came to us as an outcast, rejected by his own people for being different, Lucy said. But he transformed his rejection into a gift, using his own experience of exclusion to help others find inclusion. He taught us that the greatest strength of any community comes not from its similarities, but from its willingness to embrace and learn from its differences. The monument erected in Broken Sky's honor stands in the center of Cedar Falls, bearing an inscription in English, Apache, Chinese, Spanish, and German that reads, "In memory of Broken Sky," who showed us that every person cast out by one community might be exactly what another community needs to flourish. Today, Cedar Falls continues to thrive as one of the most diverse and prosperous communities in Kansas. The principles of inclusion and acceptance that Broken Sky helped establish have been passed down through generations, creating a culture that continues to welcome newcomers and benefit from the contributions of people from around the world. The Broken Sky Institute for Community Integration, established in 1950, continues to study and promote the methods that made Cedar Falls successful. The Institute's research has influenced community development projects in dozens of countries, helping to create more inclusive societies worldwide. The story of the Outcast Sanctuary serves as a powerful reminder that the people we reject often possess exactly the qualities we most need. Broken Sky's size and strength, which had made him an outcast among his own people, proved to be precisely what Cedar Falls needed to survive and thrive. More importantly, his story demonstrates that sanctuary is not just about providing refuge to those in need, but about creating communities where everyone can contribute their unique gifts without fear of rejection or discrimination. The courage to offer sanctuary to one Apache outcast transformed an entire town and created a legacy that continues to inspire communities around the world today.